The porch light was still on. That was the first thing Clara Bennett noticed as she stood in the rain on Maple Ridge Road, 2 suitcases at her feet and 31 years behind her. The porch light was still on the same fixture she had chosen from a salvage shop in Black Mountain. The same amber glass she had cleaned with a soft cloth every spring because she liked the way it made the evening look warm. It was still on. And the man who had just changed the locks did not think to turn it off. Preston Bennett stood in the doorway for exactly 3 seconds. He looked down at her, not with guilt, not with apology, with the calm, measured expression of a man who had already moved the figures around the ledger and found the numbers satisfying. Then he stepped back inside. The new deadbolt clicked into place, a sound so small and so final that Clara felt it somewhere behind her sternum, like a key turning in a lock that had always been there, and she had simply never known it. She did not move. The rain came down steady and quiet. The kind of rain that does not announce itself, the kind that has simply always been there. It darkened the shoulders of her jacket. It ran down through her hair and along the back of her neck. The porch light threw its amber circle across the wet steps, and she stood just outside that circle in the dark, holding nothing. 31 years. 31 years of sanding, painting, replanting, rebuilding. 31 years of knowing which floorboards creaked and which window needed an extra push in humid weather, and which corner of the garden flooded if the drainage was not cleared before October. 31 years of making a neglected, forgotten house into something that people stopped and looked at when they walked down the street. The court had taken 6 hours to decide it was not hers. 4 days after that night, Clara Bennett drove north out of Asheville up into the Blue Ridge, past Burnsville and onto a gravel road that appeared on no digital map. She was following directions written by hand on a piece of paper by a woman who had been dead for 8 years. She was following them because that woman had never once given her bad directions. When the road ended in a small clearing and a cabin appeared between the trees, Clara understood 2 things at the same time: that her grandmother had been protecting her for far longer than she had known, and that whatever was hidden inside that place was the reason Ruth Whitfield had spent 30 years working in a courthouse and paying very close attention to how the record works. She did not know yet what was under the floor, but she was about to find out, and it was going to change everything. To understand why we have to go back to a wet Thursday afternoon in October of 1994, when Clara Webb, not yet Bennett, sat in a car on Maple Ridge Road in Asheville, North Carolina, and saw something through the rain-streaked windshield that her husband did not see. Preston did not turn off the engine. That small detail matters. He sat behind the wheel and looked at the house at the end of the street. The way a contractor looks at an estimate he already knows he is going to reject. The porch leaned slightly to the left. The white paint had given up in large curling patches. The flower beds had been surrendered to weeds so long ago that the weeds had started to look intentional. He looked at all of it and shook his head with the patient disappointment of a man who considers himself practical. Clara was already out to the car. She climbed the front steps before the realtor, a steady, no-nonsense woman named Diane Marsh, could finish her standard disclaimer about the property needing significant work. Clara touched the old brass doorknob. She looked at the shape of the upstairs windows, the proportions of the porch. the way the roofline sat against the gray sky. She was not seeing it the way a dreamer sees a house. She was seeing it the way a craftsman sees a piece of wood. Not what it was, but what it could become in the right hands. Inside, Preston cataloged problems. Water stains on the ceilings, warped trim around the door frames, a kitchen floor so dull it had forgotten it was ever anything but gray. Clara cataloged the same things and reached different conclusions. The ceiling stains suggested a roof issue that had already been repaired. The stains were old and dry. The warped trim was cosmetic. The kitchen floor was oak underneath years of neglect, and oak does not die easily. When she stepped into the kitchen, she stopped. There was a cabinet door hanging crooked on its hinge. There was a window clouded from years of weather and dust. But the light came through that window at an angle that made the whole room feel inhabited, as though the house had kept a candle burning even when no one was home. Clara stood still for what felt like a long time, but was probably 20 seconds. She placed her hand flat on the old countertop. Some places do not impress you. They recognize you. That night after Preston had said the numbers made no sense for the third time and gone to bed, Clara sat alone at the kitchen table of their small rented duplex. She spread the inspection report in front of her. Beside it were repair estimates, mortgage calculations, and the shortfall in their down payment that she had been quietly trying to solve for 2 weeks. She looked at all of it for a long time. Then she picked up the phone and called her grandmother. Ruth Whitfield had a way of listening that made you feel like you were the only thing happening in the world. She did not interrupt. She did not offer reassurance before you had finished speaking. She simply listened with full attention. And when Clara finished laying out every number and every obstacle, Ruth asked one question. When you stood in that kitchen, did it feel like yours? Clara closed her eyes. The light came back. The angle of it through the dusty window. The oak floor underneath the gray. The proportions of the room. The quiet that felt inhabited rather than empty. Yes, she said. Come by tomorrow. The next afternoon, Ruth set a cashier's check on the kitchen table and slid it across without ceremony. The amount was enough for the down payment gap. Clara stared at it and told her grandmother she could not accept it. And Ruth looked at her with the particular patience of a woman who has decided what she is going to do and is simply waiting for the conversation to catch up. You can, she said, and you will. I do not know when I can pay it back. It is not a loan. Clara looked up. Ruth's face was calm, but her eyes were clear in the way that made excuses feel wasteful. Then Ruth said something she would repeat in different forms over the years, and which would eventually prove to be the most important thing she ever told her granddaughter. This is a gift to you, not to Preston, not to the marriage, to you. Keep records of everything you contribute to that house. Love may be honest. Paperwork is not always kind. She slid a small folded note across the table. On the outside in blue ink, for the house that already knows your name. Clara almost laughed. She thought her grandmother was being overly careful, the way old women sometimes are carrying caution that belongs to an earlier and harder era. She tucked the note in her pocket and drove home. She did not understand yet that Ruth Whitfield was not being cautious. Ruth was being precise. She had spent 30 years as a clerk in Yancey County Court, filing and stamping every variety of human document. Deeds of sale, divorce decrees, contested wills, bankruptcies. She had watched the legal system operate with complete impartiality, protecting whatever the paperwork said, and only what the paperwork said. She had seen enough to know that the system does not protect truth. It protects the record. And she had already decided before Clara bought the house that she was going to make sure Clara had a record of her own. What Ruth did that same afternoon after Clara drove away was this. She called her own attorney, a retired man she had known from 30 years of courthouse work, and had him help her draft and notarize a formal statement. It was 2 paragraphs long. It was signed and witnessed and properly filed with the county. It said in the precise language that Ruth had spent a career learning to trust that the funds she was providing to her granddaughter, Clara Webb, were a personal family gift, intended solely for Clara's contribution toward the purchase of a specific property in Asheville, North Carolina. That this amount was separate from any marital assets, had not been provided to the marital unit, and represented the private financial contribution of Clara Webb alone. Ruth kept a copy in her wooden box at home. She gave a copy to Thomas Reed, the notary's assistant at the closing office in Marion, who would handle the Maple Ridge Road transaction the following month. She kept the original cashier's check receipt with its memo line reading "Gift to Clara Webb. Residential purchase, separate family contribution, not marital property" in the same folder alongside the notarized statement. She did all of this on the same day she gave Clara the check. Before the house was even purchased. Before there was any sign, any indication, any whisper of a reason to think she would ever need to. That was Ruth Whitfield. That was the kind of woman she was. What happened on Maple Ridge Road over the next 31 years is the kind of thing that is easy to describe in facts and impossible to fully convey in them. Clara stripped the kitchen cabinets down to bare wood and refinished them by hand. She relaid the kitchen floor with terracotta tiles she found at a salvage warehouse in Black Mountain. 300 tiles, no two exactly alike. Their variation creating a surface that looked as though it had always been there. She hired a contractor named Frank Hadley, a blunt and meticulous man from Black Mountain who had been laying floors and building trim since before Clara was born. And he looked at her hand-drawn design and nodded the way experienced craftsmen nod when they see someone who actually knows what they want. She replumbed the drainage in the back garden. She rebuilt the front porch. Every board measured, every joist checked, every piece of hardware chosen for durability rather than appearance. She rescued the dogwood tree in the side yard when the roots began to show signs of rot, reading about treatment and doing the work herself on a Saturday in November, when the temperature dropped unexpectedly, and she worked in her coat with her breath visible in the cold air. She kept every receipt. She logged every expense in a notebook with the date and the vendor and the nature of the work, because her grandmother had told her to, and because it turned out that part of her had understood the warning, even when the rest of her dismissed it. Every few months she would mention a project to Ruth on the phone: the new drainage system in the back garden, the rebuilt chimney flashing the kitchen window she had finally sourced the correct replacement glass for, and Ruth would ask questions. Careful, specific questions, and sometimes ask to see the receipts when Clara came to visit. Clara thought her grandmother was simply interested. Ruth was doing something more deliberate than that. She was filing. She was building. She was adding piece by piece to the record she had started on the day the house was purchased. In those early years, Preston praised Clara openly. He stood in doorways and said she had a rare eye. He invited people over and watched them pause in the entryway and look around with the particular expression of someone trying to identify what makes a space feel alive, and he accepted their admiration with modest grace. He was not lying in those moments. He genuinely appreciated what Clara created. That was how it began, not with malice exactly, but with a man who discovered that someone else's talent was very useful to him, and who began slowly and without ever making a formal decision to treat it as his own. The first time Clara noticed it, she was in the middle of answering a dinner guest's question about the color she had chosen for the dining room walls. She was explaining how she had tested 4 samples and watched the way the light changed each of them throughout the day before deciding. She was about 3 sentences into the answer when Preston stepped in. "We spent a long time getting that right," he said. "You know how it is with these older homes. Everything has to be considered carefully." The guest nodded and turned to Preston. The conversation moved on. Clara sat with her wineglass and said nothing. She noticed. She forgave it. She moved on. That was the order of things. The second time was at a dinner Preston hosted for 2 of his real estate clients. Clara had prepared the house for hours, polished the floors, set the table, cut rosemary from the garden, placed candles where the dining room shadows fell too heavily. During dessert, one of the clients looked around the room and said, "Preston, this house has exactly the feeling you should be creating in your listings." Preston smiled. "That is what I have been trying to teach my team," he said. Clara was holding the coffee pot. Her hands stopped moving for a moment, not long enough for anyone to see, but long enough for something inside her to understand clearly what had just happened. He had not simply accepted a compliment. He had taken a room she made and turned it into evidence of his own professional vision. The following week, he brought home photographs from a listing near Biltmore Forest. The property was expensive and cold, the kind of place that sells square footage rather than feeling. "Help me warm it up," he said. "You know the way you do." Clara worked at the kitchen table until close to midnight. She restructured the brochure, changed the language, softened the photography selections, built a story around the house that allowed potential buyers to imagine themselves actually living in it rather than simply measuring rooms. Preston presented it to the client Monday morning. By Friday, he had a signed agreement. The following month, his website carried a new line, "Creative Property Positioning" by Preston Bennett. Clara found it by accident while looking for his office phone number. She read it twice. She could feel the specific shape of every word she had written, still living inside that phrase. Her work was there. Her name was not. Preston came into the room while she was still looking at the screen. He glanced at the laptop, kissed the top of her head, and said, "Looks professional, does it not?" She wanted to say that was mine. Instead, she said, "It looks good." That sentence became a door she closed on herself, and she would close it again and again over the years that followed. Listing copy, design boards, client packets, open house layouts, thank you notes written in Preston's voice, only warmer. She told herself it was partnership, but partnership leaves fingerprints on both sides. This arrangement only left his. Ruth Whitfield came to visit in the late spring of a year when the kitchen table was covered with Preston's client materials, and Clara had been sitting there since morning trimming photographs and arranging samples into neat rows. Ruth stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment looking at the work spread across the table before she looked at Clara. "Is your name on any of this?" Clara kept her eyes on the scissors. "It is for his business." "That was not what I asked." Before Clara could answer, Preston walked in. He was on his phone. He kissed Clara's cheek without looking at the table, then caught Ruth's eye and smiled with the easy warmth he deployed in all professional contexts. "Keeping her busy," he said. "She likes having something useful to do." The word useful landed softly. That was what made it worse. A sharp word you can push back against. A soft one settles into the floor and stays there. Ruth did not argue. She watched Preston leave the room still talking, still carrying his importance around like a briefcase. And after the front door closed, she reached into her purse without a word. She took out an old iron key tied with a loop of blue thread. She placed it in Clara's palm and folded Clara's fingers over it. "There is a cabin past Burnsville," she said. "My name is on the deed. It has nothing to do with your marriage, nothing to do with your joint property. No one, not Preston, not his attorney, will find it by looking through his records." Clara looked down at the key. It was heavier than it looked. "Grandma, why are you giving me this now?" Ruth's expression did not change. "Because a woman should have at least one door in this world that no one else controls." Clara almost smiled. She wanted to say that Preston would never do anything that required her to have a secret door. But the client packet on the table carried no trace of her name. And for the first time, the key did not feel dramatic. It felt like a reasonable precaution from a woman who had watched the legal system operate for 3 decades and drawn her conclusions without sentiment. Ruth was 68 years old when she gave Clara that key. She had known from the afternoon Clara called her about the house that the situation might one day require more than goodwill and good intentions, and the honest work of capable hands. She had spent the years since preparing for that possibility with the methodical patience of a woman who has seen exactly how these situations develop and exactly what is needed to stop them. Every receipt Clara had ever mentioned in a phone call, Ruth had asked to see and had quietly copied. Every photograph she had taken of Clara working in the house she had kept and annotated with the date and the nature of the work. She had continued to add to the folder year by year quietly without ever suggesting she was doing anything other than staying interested in her granddaughter's life. She had been building a case for 3 decades, and she had placed everything she built in a tin box in a cabin that Preston Bennett did not know existed. And 3 months before she died, she told Clara exactly where to look. That conversation happened in August of 2017. Clara drove up to Burnsville because Ruth had not sounded well on the phone, and when she arrived, Ruth was sitting near the window with a blanket over her knees, thinner than she had been the previous winter, but watching the world outside with the same quality of attention she had always brought to it, the kind of attention that does not come from having nothing left to notice, but from having decided long ago what matters and made your peace with the rest. They talked about ordinary things for a while. The garden, a dry summer, a listing Preston was proud of that had stayed on the market longer than he expected. Ruth listened and let Clara talk. And then, with the directness that had always been her most reliable quality, she asked, "Has he been putting paperwork in front of you lately?" Clara went still. "For the house? For his business?" "Just routine things." Ruth reached into the wooden box beside her chair. She removed a small envelope tied with blue thread. She placed it in Clara's hands. "The cabin key is still yours," she said. But a key may not be enough. Under the kitchen table, third board from the left. It is loose. Leave it loose. What is under it? Something Preston cannot explain away. Clara drove home that afternoon holding the envelope and telling herself that her grandmother was simply being careful, in the way that very old people sometimes become careful holding on tightly to things, wanting to account for every possibility. She put the envelope in her cedar chest. She did not open it. 3 months later, Ruth Whitfield died quietly at 91 years old, in the same house she had lived in since before Clara's mother was born. She left behind a small estate, a reputation for precision that everyone who had worked with her at the county court still mentioned years later, and a tin box under a floorboard in a cabin near Burnsville waiting in the dark for the day it would finally be needed. That day came on a Monday morning in April of 2025. Clara was outside pruning the hydrangeas along the south fence. Her gloves were damp from the morning dew. Her knees ached in the way that knees ache when you have been kneeling on the ground for the better part of an hour. And you are 59 years old. And you are doing it because you genuinely cannot imagine leaving the garden untended, even though some part of you has known for weeks that something is coming. The mail carrier handed her the certified envelope and looked away too quickly. That is a small thing, but it matters. There is a specific way that people look away when they are delivering news they know is bad. It is not avoidance exactly. It is something more like respect. An instinct to give a person the privacy of their first moment with a difficult thing. Clara carried the envelope inside and set it on the kitchen table. Preston was in his office on the phone, laughing in the smooth professional register he used when money was on the line. She sat down and looked at the envelope for a moment. Then she heard his footsteps in the hallway, and he appeared in the kitchen doorway and saw the envelope on the table, and his expression for just a moment, less than a second, showed her something she had not seen before. Not guilt, not remorse. The expression of a man who has been waiting for a particular piece to fall into place and has just watched it land exactly where he arranged for it to land. Then the expression was gone, and he was composed again. "I wanted to talk to you before that arrived," he said. "No," Clara said. "You wanted it to arrive before I could ask questions." He did not answer. That silence damaged things that words might not have reached. In the weeks that followed, Clara learned how fast a marriage can become a transaction. The house became an asset. The 31 years became a column of account names, payment records, and legal phrases that had been crafted to sound neutral and functioned as instruments of dispossession. Her attorney, a careful, clear-eyed woman named Lorraine Cole, who worked from a narrow office near downtown Asheville and had the quality of never making the truth sound softer than it was, spread Preston's documents across her desk one afternoon and read through them with an expression that Clara recognized as the controlled version of something more serious. "Some of these signatures gave him more control than you realized," Lorraine said. "The house?" Lorraine nodded slowly. The refinancing in 1998 strengthened his position in the asset structure. The equity adjustment in 2003 made it more explicit. His attorney will argue that his income was the primary financial driver of the property. "I built that house," Clara said. She was not raising her voice. She did not need to. "I do not mean it loosely. I stripped the walls. I sanded the floors. I paid for materials out of my personal account. I helped his business grow so that he could keep paying the mortgage while I was creating everything that made the property worth what it is worth. I believe you, Lorraine said. Then she looked back at the file, and Clara understood. Belief was not evidence. Belief did not enter the courtroom. What entered the courtroom was paper, and the paper said what Preston had spent years arranging for it to say. The hearing took place on a gray morning in Buncombe County. Preston wore a navy suit. Clara wore a black dress she had bought years ago for a funeral, and had never imagined she would wear to watch her own life divided into categories by strangers in a fluorescent room. Marcus Elroy Preston's attorney, a man with the particular confidence of someone who has never lost a case he considered important, spoke first. The language he used was clean and efficient. Primary income, documented payment history, established asset structure, equitable settlement terms. Each phrase moved the needle, and the needle pointed away from Clara. Lorraine presented what she had. Clara's labor, the renovation timeline, the role Clara had played in building Preston's business, the assessments of the property's increase in value over the years of Clara's care. It was all real. It was all true. But the courtroom kept returning to the same questions again and again, like water finding the path of least resistance. Who signed, who paid, whose name appears in the filing? Clara sat at the table and thought about the porch she had rebuilt board by board, about the night she slept on the dining room floor because the wood stain needed one more coat before morning, and she did not want to risk tracking footprints across it, about the dogwood tree she had saved in November with cold hands, and a treatment she had read about in a book she ordered specifically for that purpose. None of it had a line on any legal form. None of it had been witnessed by anyone whose name carried weight in a courtroom. It had simply been done thoroughly and without complaint by a woman who believed that the work itself was enough. When the final terms were announced, she heard them through a strange quiet. Preston would retain the house. Clara would receive a settlement enough to survive on for a period of time, not enough to replace what had been built over 31 years. Afterward, outside on the courthouse steps, Preston was waiting. She had thought for one brief and perhaps naive moment that he might say something true. Instead, he adjusted the cuffs of his jacket and said, "I hope we can both move forward with dignity." Dignity. He did not mean honesty. He meant silence. Clara walked past him without answering. She spent that night in the back bedroom of a house in Weaverville, in a room belonging to a woman from her church named Frances Mills, who had made up the bed with clean sheets and left a lamp burning by the window, and not asked any questions at all. The room was kind, but nothing in it knew her. Not the walls, not the window, not the floor that stayed quiet in all the wrong places. She woke at 2 in the morning and reached for the left side of the bed out of 31 years of habit. Her fingers found empty air. She lay still for a long time. She listened to the sounds of a house that was not hers. The particular creak of the hallway, settling the tick of a radiator she had not learned to expect. Then she got up and knelt in front of her grandmother's cedar chest, which she had brought because Preston did not want it. The chest smelled of lavender and old wood. Inside were table linens, old sewing patterns, a worn Bible with a cracked spine, and Christmas cards tied with kitchen twine. And there, pressed against the left corner, was a small envelope, blue thread around it. 5 words on the front in Ruth's handwriting, the letters careful and deliberate as though she had written them knowing they would need to carry weight when you have nowhere left. Clara sat back on her heels and held the envelope for a moment before opening it. Inside was the iron key, darker than she remembered, heavier, in the way that things become heavy when they have been waiting. And behind it, a hand-drawn map on a piece of folded notepaper. Past Burnsville, beyond the Cane River, left where the pavement narrows. 3rd gravel road after the old white church. At the bottom of the page, one line in her grandmother's hand. Go before you start believing their version of you. Clara read it once. She read it again. Outside, a truck passed on the wet road and faded into the dark. For the first time since the courthouse, something moved beneath the grief. Not hope exactly. Not yet. Something more fundamental than hope. Direction. By first light, both suitcases were packed again. Frances found her at the front door with the cedar chest under one arm and the iron key in her closed hand, and the expression of a woman who has decided where she is going, even if she is not yet certain of what she will find there. "You sure about this?" Frances asked. Clara looked at the pale morning through the front window. "No," she said, "but my grandmother was." And somewhere past Burnsville, on a road that appeared on no digital map, a cabin was waiting with a floor that had been loose for 30 years, and a tin box that had been patient for 8, holding everything that the legal system had been designed to overlook. Every receipt, every photograph, every notarized word of a woman who had spent her career watching the record win and had decided before the record was even a threat that her granddaughter was going to have one of her own. The road north out of Asheville does not feel like escape. That is the first thing Clara noticed as she drove it in the pale early morning with both suitcases in the trunk and her grandmother's cedar chest secured on the back seat, and the iron key sitting in the cup holder where she could see it. It did not feel like running. It felt like driving toward a question she had not yet earned the right to ask, or perhaps toward the answer to a question that had been waiting for her much longer than she knew. The mountains were still gray in that early light, layered and patient in the way that mountains are patient, as though they have seen enough human grief to understand that it moves through at its own pace and does not require their involvement. The fog sat low in the valleys between the ridgelines. The road narrowed as she went north, peeling away from the commercial stretches and the subdivisions and the familiar infrastructure of the life she had just been removed from, and becoming something simpler and older and more honest about what it was. She checked the key at every traffic light for the first 30 miles, not because she thought it would disappear, because looking at it confirmed something that Ruth had left a door, that the door was real, that the instructions on the hand-drawn map were not a grief-softened hallucination she had constructed in a dark room at 2 in the morning. The key was real. The solid weight of it in her palm had been real. The map was folded in her jacket pocket, and she had already memorized it, but she kept it there anyway, close to her chest, the way you keep the one thing you are not willing to lose. Past Burnsville, the highway gave way to 2-lane roads, and the 2-lane roads gave way to farm tracks, and the farm tracks gave way to forest. Rhododendron crowded the shoulders so thickly that in places the canopy closed overhead, and she was driving through a tunnel of green and shadow. Branches brushed the sides of the car. The cell signal dropped away somewhere around the last gas station and did not return. and for the first time in weeks, there was no attorney, no courthouse, no settlement document waiting to be reviewed, no Preston, no Maple Ridge Road behind its new brass lock. There was only the road, the key, the map, and the sound of gravel beginning to crunch under her tires as she turned onto the third track, past the old white church. The church appeared just after noon. Small and weathered, a clapboard building with a cemetery tilting behind it, on the slope headstones in uneven rows, catching what thin light came through the overcast sky. She slowed as she passed it. The pavement ended without ceremony. The gravel track climbed between walls of rhododendron and old pine, and the car moved up through it carefully, the suspension working over the stone's branches close on both sides. And then after nearly 3 miles, the trees opened. Clara stopped the car at the edge of the clearing and did not move for a long moment. The cabin sat low in the open ground as though it had grown there, rather than been built patient and unremarkable, the kind of structure that survives precisely by not advertising itself. The cedar siding had weathered to a pale silver gray over decades of mountain seasons, each year of rain and cold, and summer heat leaving its mark on the wood until the whole surface had taken on the color of patience itself. The tin roof had been darkened by years of rain, and the slow accumulation of pine needles along its seams, staining it in irregular patterns that followed the angle of the prevailing wind. The front porch had one railing loose on the left side. She noted it with the automatic eye of someone who has spent 30 years reading buildings, calculating what is cosmetic and what is structural, what a Saturday afternoon can address, and what requires more careful attention. 2 front windows were clouded with years of undisturbed dust. Nothing about it invited notice. Nothing about it suggested that what it contained had been carefully arranged and patiently preserved for more than 3 decades. She stepped out of the car. The mountain air was cool and damp and carried the smell of pine and moss and old wood that has survived more winters than anyone has thought to thank it for. The ground was soft underfoot, a layer of fallen leaves making her footsteps almost silent. She crossed to the porch and stood for a moment with her hand on the railing, the loose one on the left, which moved about an inch before finding resistance. She tested the way the boards flexed under her weight. They were still sound, just weathered. She assessed all of it the way she had always assessed everything, cataloging and calculating, because that was how her mind had always worked. Because she had spent 30 years looking at structures and understanding what they needed. Because that particular skill does not stop operating just because a court has told you that it belongs to someone else. The lock was old iron and it resisted when she put the key in. She turned harder. The mechanism inside made a sound like something partially rusted, and then it gave and the door swung inward on hinges that had not moved in years, exhaling a breath of cold cedar and closed up dark into the afternoon air. Clara stood in the doorway and looked. One main room, a stone fireplace on the far wall with a lintel of rough-hewn timber, and a layer of gray ash sitting cold in the grate. A narrow bed against the wall beneath the east window, a wool blanket folded at its foot, a rocking chair positioned near the south window to catch the light, shelves along one wall holding mason jars, short candles, pieces of folded cloth, and there, centered under the south-facing window, positioned to receive what afternoon light came through the clouded glass, Ruth Whitfield's kitchen table, plain wood, A surface crossed with small scars from years of genuine use knife marks near one corner. A pale ring from an old cup. A crescent-shaped burn near the edge that Clara did not remember and could not place some story the table had absorbed that she would never fully know. 2 chairs waited on either side of it, solid and unhurried. Clara stepped inside and pulled the door closed behind her. The cabin smelled of cedar and cold ash, and something faintly sweet. Beneath both of those, lavender possibly, or the particular quality of air that has been held quietly inside old wood for a very long time. She stood still and let the silence settle around her. It was a different quality of silence than she had known in the weeks since the hearing. That silence had been the silence of interruption, of absence of a life suddenly and forcibly halted. This was the silence of a place that had never learned to be noisy, a silence that had been there before she arrived, and would be there long after she left, patient and complete. She walked the perimeter of the room slowly. She ran her hand along the shelves across the curved back of the rocking chair over the footboard of the narrow bed. She came to the table and stood beside it, and looked at the scars in the surface for a long time, the evidence of a life lived at this particular piece of wood. Then she sat down in one of the chairs and let the stillness settle into her the way warmth settles into a cold room, gradually from the edges inward, filling the spaces that had been empty. For a few minutes she thought this was the whole of what Ruth had sent her here for. A place to breathe. A place where the walls had never learned Preston's name. A place where no one needed her to be composed or grateful or reasonable. She sat in the chair and let herself be completely still, and it was almost enough. Then her eyes dropped to the floor beneath the table. The floorboards ran unevenly across the room. The natural irregularity of construction, done by handboards laid and settling over decades into their own particular arrangement. Most of them were tied against each other, fitting the way things fit when they have had sufficient time to find their position. One was not. Third from the left under the table, just as Ruth had said in a room in Burnsville that had smelled of peppermint tea and old books years ago, in what had felt at the time like an overabundance of caution. Third board from the left. It is loose. Leave it loose. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Clara lowered herself from the chair to the floor. Her knees pressed into the dust. She could feel the grain of the boards through the fabric of her jeans. She reached under the table and found the edge of the third board and pressed it slightly, testing, and it moved. It tilted up on one end with the ease of something that had been designed to be opened, not something that had simply worked loose through settling or age. She lifted it. The space beneath was shallow, perhaps 4 inches deep, carefully lined with old newspaper. The date on the nearest page was October 1989, and resting in that space, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had been folded and tucked with the precision of someone who expected it to remain there for a long time, a tin box. Clara reached in and lifted it out slowly. It was lighter than she expected and heavier than it looked. The specific contradiction that belongs to things carrying heavy meaning in a small container. She set it on the floor beside her and looked at it for a moment. Then she took the iron key from her pocket, the same key that had opened the cabin door, and tried it in the lock on instinct. The lock turned. The box opened with a sound she felt more than heard. A small click, a small release, and then the world went very still. Not the dust in the thin light. Not the light itself coming through the south window. Not Clara. She looked at what Ruth Whitfield had placed in this box and carried to this cabin and hidden under this floor and spent years keeping safe. No jewelry, no cash, no bundle of sentiment tied with ribbon. A blue folder faded at the corners and soft along the edges from age, tied with a length of white string. Across the front, 7 words in her grandmother's handwriting written in the careful, deliberate script of someone who understood that what they were writing might one day be read in a moment of great need, and who wanted the words to be absolutely clear for the house they may try to take. Clara untied the string with steady hands. The folder opened to a letter. Ruth's handwriting across 2 pages slower than Clara remembered it being in earlier years, but still firm. Still controlled the hand of a woman who is setting down something she has thought about for a long time, and is now committing to paper in exactly the order she intends. My Clara, if you are reading this, someone has made you feel that the life you built can be taken from you, because your name was not placed where it should have been. I could not make you see Preston clearly before you were ready. A woman has to arrive at that understanding in her own time. And I knew better than to try to rush yours. But I could keep records. I could keep proof. I could make sure that when memory was not enough, and I knew from 30 years in that courthouse that memory is often not enough, there would be something else. Something with a date on it. Something with a signature that means more than mine alone. Clara set the letter down on the floor beside her. She kept her breathing steady. She kept going. The first document was a copy of the cashier's check from November 1994. The memo line was printed with complete clarity. Gift to Clara Webb Residential Purchase. Separate family contribution. Not marital property. Below the memo line was the bank's processing stamp, the date of the transaction, and the account number. Clara read it twice, then a third time slowly, as though she needed to be certain the words would stay. For months, Preston's version of the house had sounded official, had carried the particular weight that legal language carries when it is the only language in the room. Now Ruth's version had a bank stamp that was 31 years old. And bank stamps do not adjust their meaning based on how convincing an attorney happens to be. Behind the check were transfer records, copies of old deposit slips, a receipt from the closing attorney's office recording the transaction, and then something more, a notarized statement properly signed and witnessed. Dated November 14th, 1994. Clara read the first paragraph, slowly parsing each word. The funds provided to my granddaughter Clara Webb, subsequently Clara Bennett, are a personal family gift intended solely for her contribution toward the purchase and protection of the property on Maple Ridge Road in Asheville, North Carolina. This amount is separate from marital assets and was not provided to the marital unit. It is the private contribution of Clara Webb alone. The room blurred at the edges. Clara placed her right palm flat on the floor. She needed the solidity of something that did not move beneath her. She kept reading. Behind the notarized statement were the receipts. Terracotta tile vendor in Black Mountain paid in full purchaser name Clara Bennett. Structural lumber for porch reconstruction. Purchaser Clara Bennett. Paint and primer 3 separate purchases spanning 2 years Clara Bennett. Garden drainage installation, hardware and materials Clara Bennett. And alongside the receipts, she had not previously seen notes in Ruth's handwriting on small index cards, clipped carefully to each one, paid from Clara's personal account. Kitchen restoration, 1995, or front porch materials, 2001, selected and purchased by Clara, or dogwood treatment, November 1996, Clara's initiative and expense, each card precise, each card dated, each card adding another line to the record that Ruth had been quietly constructing for decades. Ruth had been collecting all of this. Every time Clara mentioned a project in a phone call, every time she sent a photograph of something she had finished or begun. Ruth had been filing it, noting it, dating it, preserving it, without ever suggesting that she was doing anything more than being genuinely interested in her granddaughter's house. She had been building a record for 3 decades, and she had done it so quietly and so naturally that Clara had never once recognized it for what it was. Then the photographs, Clara in old jeans beside a stack of reclaimed floorboards. Her face turned slightly away from the camera, focused on something off-frame with the complete absorption of someone doing work they know how to do. Clara in the kitchen during the first year, hair tied back, paint on her left wrist. The cabinets behind her, frameless and doorless because she had not yet finished them. Clara kneeling in the back garden with mud on her knees and a drainage pipe in her hands. Clara on the porch with a handsaw measuring a board against the one beside it, with the automatic confidence of someone who has learned to trust her own eye. And in several of the photographs standing slightly back out of the way, not drawing attention to herself. Ruth herself. Not posing, not performing the role of the interested grandmother. Simply present, witnessing. Her expression in each photograph was identical, the focused, quiet regard of someone who understands that they are watching something worth recording and has made the deliberate decision to be there when it happens. On the back of the photograph that showed Clara standing in the unfinished kitchen paint on her left wrist, the windows behind her letting in the light she had always loved about that room. The cabinets bare in the background, Ruth had written in pencil, March 17th, 1995, the day she started making the house live again. Clara pressed that photograph flat against the floor with both hands. And then she did not hold it together anymore. Not loudly. Not in the way that grief sometimes announces itself. Her shoulders came forward and her breath caught and fractured. And the grief she had been carrying so carefully since the courthouse. The grief she had organized into practicality and logistics, and the correct legal responses, and the appropriate professional demeanor, slipped out of her hands entirely. She cried because Ruth had believed her, before there was ever a case to believe in. She cried because somebody had known years and years before the end that the record would be what mattered, and had spent those years building it with the same patient thoroughness that Clara had always brought to every room in that house. She cried because she was 59 years old, and the floor she was kneeling on was not hers, and the house she had come from was no longer hers, and she was starting from a clearing in the mountains with nothing but the truth and the paper. Her grandmother had spent 30 years building around it, and then she reached the last page in the folder and stopped crying. It was a list, 20 names written in 2 columns, precise and clear. Phone numbers beside each one. Addresses: Frank Hadley, Black Mountain; Thomas Reed, Marion; Helen Carver, Weaverville; Several contractors whose names she recognized from different years of work on the house. A former neighbor from Maple Ridge Road. A retired bookkeeper who had worked for years in Preston's office. A woman who had processed the paperwork at the closing in 1994. At the top of the page, Ruth had written 4 words in her steadiest hand. People who saw. Clara sat back against the table leg and looked at the list for a long time. She had come into the cabin thinking she was looking for a place to breathe. She had found something else entirely. Something she had not known to look for, because she had not known it existed. The cashier's check proved money. The notarized statement proved intent. The receipts proved labor. The photographs proved presence. But the names meant she might not have to stand alone in a room and say, "I built this." The names meant there were other people in the world who could say it with her. She reached for her phone. The screen showed no signal. Not one bar. Not even the indicator that means the phone is searching and has not yet given up. Nothing. Clara almost laughed, not bitterly, but with something that was almost relief. Of course. Not here. Not yet. Ruth had chosen this location with care, and one of the things she had chosen carefully was its distance from everything that had been trying to reach Clara for the past several weeks. So she gathered every page with both hands and placed them back in the blue folder. In the order she had found them, handling each one carefully, the way you handle something that has waited a long time and deserves to be treated with the respect that waiting earns. She tied the white string. She closed the tin box. She sat on the floor of her grandmother's cabin with the folder pressed against her chest and understood something she had not been able to articulate since the hearing. Ruth Whitfield had not built a hiding place. She had built a waiting room for the truth. Clara was up before dawn. She loaded both suitcases back into the car, locked the cabin behind her, leaving everything exactly as she had found it. The table, the chairs, the loose board replaced carefully over the tin box. The oilcloth rewrapped and drove down the gravel track toward the main road, watching ahead for the point where the cell signal would return. 2 bars appeared in the gravel parking area of the old white church. She pulled in and sat for a moment looking at Lorraine Cole's name on the screen. Then she called. Lorraine answered on the 4th ring. Her voice carried the particular alertness of an attorney receiving an unexpected call from a client. Careful attention, no surprise shown. "I found something," Clara said. What kind of something? The kind that changes the conversation. She read out the details methodically in the order she had encountered them in the folder. The cashier's check with the memo line. The notarized statement from November 14th, 1994. The receipts bearing her name across 3 decades of work. The photographs with Ruth's handwritten captions and dates. The list of 20 names with contact information. When she finished, there was a silence on the other end that was different from the silences Lorraine usually allowed herself, less controlled, more genuinely surprised. "Read me the date on the notarized statement again," Lorraine said. Clara read it. "And the check was issued in your name only. Not Preston's name, not both names together. Only mine. Not to a joint account or a household account. To me personally. With the memo Ruth wrote herself." Another silence, shorter. Clara, Lorraine said, finally measuring each word as she said it. "This does not hand you back the house today. The decree has been issued and reopening it requires a formal process." But what you have described changes the legal landscape significantly. A properly executed notarized statement from 1994, identifying the contribution as separate property combined with dated payment records, bearing your name and a list of potential witnesses. Marcus Elroy will not want these questions asked in any formal setting. So what do we do with it? Lorraine's voice moved into the register. Clara had learned to recognize as her working mode: efficient, precise, no words spent on anything that did not directly advance the situation. Do not contact Preston. Do not send him any message of any kind. Do not speak to anyone connected to Maple Ridge Road. Photograph every single page of that folder right now. Before you do anything else, find a copy shop and make physical duplicates of everything. Keep the originals on your person until I have copies secured on my end. She paused for exactly one beat. And Clara, that folder does not leave your hands. Not for any reason whatsoever. Not until I tell you otherwise. There was a copy shop in Burnsville, small and plain and reliable. The kind of establishment that has served the same community for 30 years with the same machines and the same quiet competence. A young woman named Wren worked the counter, short hair, round glasses. The precise and careful manner of someone who handles other people's documents all day and understands without needing to be told that the papers in front of her sometimes matter in ways that are entirely invisible from the outside. She fed each page through the scanner without comment or question. The scan light moved across Ruth's letter, over the cashier's check, over the notarized statement with its formal language and its witness signatures. Then it moved across the photograph of Clara standing in the unfinished kitchen. In the spring of 1995, paint on her left wrist. The cabinets bare behind her, the light coming through the window that she had refused to replace because she had always loved the angle of it. Wren paused. "Is that you?" she asked. "Yes," Clara said. "You look happy." Clara looked at the photograph in Wren's hand. She had spent the weeks since the hearing thinking almost exclusively about what she had lost. She had spent 31 years before that thinking almost exclusively about the work. She could not remember the last time she had thought about whether she had been happy while she was doing it, but she had been. She could see it plainly in the photograph. Not the performed happiness of someone maintaining an appearance, but the unguarded happiness of someone doing exactly the thing they were built to do, in a place that had recognized them from the first afternoon. She did not have an answer for Wren, but the question stayed with her as she drove back up the mountain. Back at the cabin that afternoon, she spread the copies across Ruth's kitchen table and opened a fresh notebook. For the first time in years, in more years than she could easily count, the columns she was setting up in that notebook were not for Preston's business. They were for her name, her case. What each person on the list might have seen and what records they might still have in a box or a file or a drawer somewhere. The first call went to Frank Hadley. He answered on the third ring with the economy of a man who has never understood why telephone pleasantries exist. Clara gave her name. A brief silence. She mentioned Maple Ridge Road and the terracotta kitchen floor and the porch reconstruction and the dogwood tree in the side yard. A longer silence, and then something shifted in the quality of his attention. "Oh," he said, "you are the one who knew the measurements." Clara's pen stopped moving on the page. "Your husband talk more." Frank said in the straightforward way of a man who has spent his life making assessments and sees no reason to soften them. But you were the one who knew the house. He paused briefly. The pause of someone deciding whether to say the thing they have been thinking. Then he said it. Last job I did there, he asked me to put the final invoice under his name. Said it kept things cleaner. I had already written it up in yours. He asked me to do a second copy. Clara wrote one word in her notebook. Clean. The same word Preston had used for the refinancing in 1998, for the equity adjustment in 2003, for every document he had placed in front of her across 31 years of kitchens and offices and evenings when she had been tired and had trusted him. Clean never meant simple. Clean meant that something had been carefully removed. Do you still have both copies of that invoice? Frank Hadley was the kind of man who kept things in labeled boxes in the basement because the alternative making decisions about what to discard had never struck him as a good use of effort when storage space was available. He thought he might still have them. He would look through the boxes that evening. The second call went to Thomas Reed in Marion, the retired notary's assistant, who had handled the closing on Maple Ridge Road in the fall of 1994. He remembered Ruth Whitfield without needing any prompting at all. She asked for copies of everything he said, every page in the file, the gift letter, the check receipt, the complete closing packet. She said, and I remember this specifically because I had not heard anyone put it quite that way before, she said, I have worked in the courthouse long enough to know that it pays to have your own file. Clara set the pen down for a moment. Ruth had started that day. Not when the cracks became visible. Not when the paperwork began accumulating on the kitchen table. The first day, the day the house was purchased, Ruth had started building Clara's case because she had already understood how the story might need to end and had decided to prepare accordingly. The third call went to Helen Carver, who had lived 3 houses down on Maple Ridge Road for 20 years before moving to Weaverville to be near her daughter. Helen remembered without qualification. You were always outside working, she said. Preston came home in the evenings and parked the car and walked in like the house had simply taken care of itself while he was gone. She paused, then added, I have photographs from the block party we had on the street in 2003. You were out in the front garden with a drill. Preston was inside talking to the Hendersons. I will find them and get them to you. Clara was working her way through the 11th name on Ruth's list when her phone lit up with a name she had not expected to see. Preston Bennett. She looked at the screen. She allowed it to ring once, then twice, 3 times. She did not answer. It went to voicemail and she waited 30 seconds before pressing play. His voice came through with the smooth, unhurried quality he used in all professional contexts. The voice he had refined over decades of sitting across tables from people he was working to bring around to his position. Clara, he said, I understand you have been contacting people about Maple Ridge Road. I am not sure what you are hoping to find. The settlement has been finalized. I would hate to see you spend what little you have left pursuing something that is not going to change the outcome. He let a brief pause land exactly where he intended it to land. I'm saying this because I care about what happens to you. Be careful. The message ended. Clara sat at her grandmother's table in the mountain quiet and held the phone in her hand and thought about a single specific problem with complete attention. Lorraine had not yet contacted Marcus Elroy's office. The calls to Frank Hadley and Thomas Reed and Helen Carver had been careful and limited, asking only about records, making no accusations. None of them had any reason to contact Preston. Someone else had. She called Lorraine immediately. Lorraine listened to the voicemail twice without speaking. Then she said, "Save it. Do not delete it under any circumstances. Do not respond to it in any way. Does it help our position? A man who genuinely feels secure does not leave a warning this early. He is reacting because he is worried. And he is worried because he knows better than anyone that his own record is not as clean as he presented it to the court." She let that land for a moment. Keep calling down the list. Ask about documents and records only. Do not mention the folder or what it contains. Let him try to calculate what you know and how much of it you can prove. The 18th name on Ruth's list was Victor Shaw, former bookkeeper for Bennett Property Group. 12 years of managing the financial operations of Preston's real estate business before retiring to Weaverville. Ruth had included him without any annotation beside his name, just the name and number, which meant she had considered him potentially relevant but had chosen not to commit in writing to exactly why. Clara called. The phone rang for a long time. She was nearly ready to give up when a man's voice answered. Older guarded the voice of someone who screens his calls carefully and rarely answers numbers he does not recognize. Who is this? Not inflected as a question, stated as a challenge. Mr. Shaw, my name is Clara Bennett. Ruth Whitfield included your name on a list. Of the sound on the other end changed immediately, a sharp intake of breath that he did not bother to conceal. What do you want? I wanted to ask about your time working with Bennett Property Group, about certain financial records from. I have nothing to say to you. Do not call this number again. The line went dead. Clara looked at the phone in her hand. Victor Shaw had not been surprised. He had been alarmed, and the alarm was not the alarm of a man caught off guard by an unexpected call. It was the specific alarm of a man who had been waiting for a call he did not want to receive. He had known she was making calls before she made this one. He had been warned, which meant he had already made his own call. And Preston had received that warning before Clara had worked her way down to name number 18 on the list. Victor Shaw was the connection. He had stayed in contact with Preston after leaving the business, and when word reached him that Clara was gathering witnesses, he had picked up the phone and given Preston exactly the early warning that had produced that voicemail. She called Thomas Reed back and asked him a different question. Not about Ruth or the closing documents, but about whether anyone else had ever contacted him in the years since 1994, to ask about the records from the Maple Ridge Road purchase. Thomas Reed was quiet for a moment, thinking back. About 11 years ago, he said at last, 2014, I believe. Someone called with questions about the asset structure of the original purchase transaction. Professional manner, clearly an attorney. The questions were very specific, whether there were any separately documented family contributions in the original file and exactly which names appeared on the various payment records and instruments. Clara kept her voice even. Did they identify themselves? Said they were representing a client in a related transaction. Standard cover language. But the specificity of the questions was unusual. Those were not the questions you ask for a routine transaction review. Those were questions you ask when you already know what you are looking for. and you want to confirm it is there. Did you tell them what the file contained? I told them what was a matter of public record, that the original gift documentation existed and had been properly filed, that there was a separate family contribution from the buyer's side documented at the time of closing. Clara set her pen down on the table. She did not need to write the next part down, because it had already assembled itself in her mind with the particular clarity that comes when you finally have all the pieces and can see the shape they make together. In 2014, Marcus Elroy, working on behalf of Preston, who had by then already begun thinking seriously about what an eventual divorce might require him to have in place, had gone looking for exactly the kind of documentation Ruth had created and preserved. He had found the reference to a separate family contribution properly filed in the public record. He had understood immediately what that contribution represented as a vulnerability in Preston's position in any future division of assets. And from that point forward, from 2014 onward, the documents Preston placed in front of Clara to sign had been specifically and deliberately designed to bury that contribution as completely as the available legal language would permit. Each document had been crafted not with the aim of making things administratively simpler, as Preston had always claimed, but with the aim of layering over the record that Ruth had built until it was no longer visible. This was not a man who had gradually and opportunistically taken advantage of his position. This was a man who had identified a specific vulnerability 11 years before using it, and had spent those 11 years constructing a legal architecture designed to neutralize it. With the assistance of his attorney, with full awareness of what he was doing and why, Clara called Lorraine and laid it out in exactly that order. Thomas Reed's account, the date of the inquiry, the specific questions the caller had asked, the way Victor Shaw had reacted, the timeline of documents that had followed 2014. Lorraine listened without interrupting once. When Clara finished, there was a silence that meant Lorraine was thinking through implications rather than composing a response. Then Lorraine said, "You just gave me something I did not expect we would be able to find." Clara waited. "I can demonstrate a pattern of behavior, not an error, not an oversight or a misclassification, not a misunderstanding about how property law applies to this specific situation. A documented, sustained pattern of deliberate action spanning more than a decade with the direct involvement of legal counsel. That is fundamentally different from anything we presented at the original hearing. It opens different remedies and it creates a different kind of pressure." It was nearly dark outside when the headlights appeared. Clara was at the table transferring Preston's voicemail into her notebook, word by word, working slowly and carefully, because she wanted the record to be exact when the light moved across the cabin wall in an arc that meant a vehicle was coming up the gravel road. She went still. Through the dusty south window, she watched a vehicle climb toward the clearing at a speed that was too deliberate for someone who was lost, and too slow for someone with legitimate business to conduct. The headlights stopped at the edge of the tree line. A black SUV, Preston's. Clara stood up from the table and did not touch the light switch. She moved to the side of the south window where she could see the clearing without being visible from it. Preston stepped out of the vehicle and stood at the edge of the open ground and looked at the cabin. He did not call out her name. He did not walk toward the porch. He simply stood in the near dark and examined the building with the expression she had seen him use on properties he was considering acquiring, not the expression of someone facing an emotional situation, but the calculating expression of someone assessing the dimensions of a problem and determining how much of an obstacle it represents. Behind her on the table, the blue folder was open. The notebook lay beside it, with the voicemail transcription half completed. Preston's voicemail had been forwarded to Lorraine's secure email hours earlier. Every page of the folder had been photographed and transmitted before that. He did not know any of it. He had come to measure the threat, to see whether the woman who had built his house and populated his business and signed his documents was sitting alone in the mountains in genuine possession of something dangerous, or whether she was simply grieving and grasping and would eventually exhaust herself and go quiet. The dark cabin and the single car in the clearing gave him one kind of answer, not the complete one. After almost exactly a minute, he got back into the SUV. The door closed. The engine started. The headlights swept back across the cabin wall as he turned, and then they disappeared into the trees, and the sound of the engine faded down the gravel track, and the clearing settled back into its nighttime quiet. The only sounds that remained were the creak behind the cabin and the light movement of air through the pine branches at the edge of the clearing. Clara exhaled. He had not come to apologize or to negotiate or to acknowledge anything. He had come to assess the risk she represented, and the quiet cabin and the silent mountainside had perhaps given him a degree of reassurance he had not fully earned. By tomorrow, he would have had time to reconsider. By tomorrow morning, Lorraine's formal demand letter would be in preparation. By tomorrow, the 4 carefully constructed questions it contained, questions that did not accuse, but that had 31 years of documented evidence standing directly behind them, would be making their way toward Marcus Elroy's desk. Clara sat back down at the table. She picked up her pen and finished transferring the voicemail into the notebook word by word to the final syllable of the last sentence. Then she closed the notebook and placed it precisely on top of the blue folder, and sat for a while in the quiet of her grandmother's cabin and did not look behind her, because there was nothing behind her that was worth looking at anymore. Everything that mattered was on the table in front of her, and in the morning it was going to speak louder than anything Preston Bennett had arranged for any room to say. The demand letter went out on a Tuesday morning, and Lorraine Cole had written it with the economy and precision of someone who has learned that the most effective legal document is often the shortest one. The one that says exactly what it needs to say and trusts the facts to do the work that rhetoric cannot. It was not an accusation. That was its entire power. It was 4 questions formally addressed to Marcus Elroy at his office on Lexington Avenue in Asheville, transmitted through the proper channels with copies filed where they needed to be. And it asked the kinds of questions that a man who has spent more than a decade constructing a careful legal architecture does not want to see posed in writing, because written questions require written answers. And written answers enter the record, and the record was precisely the ground on which Ruth Whitfield had spent 30 years learning to operate. Why had the separate family contribution documented in the notarized statement of November 14, 1994, not been disclosed during the asset division proceedings? Why had renovation costs paid from Clara Bennett's personal accounts and recorded under her name in vendor records been characterized as joint marital expenditure? Why had Preston Bennett contacted Clara Bennett by voicemail message within hours of her beginning to gather witness accounts? before any formal notification had been provided to his legal counsel? And why had Preston Bennett appeared at a private property registered in the name of Ruth Whitfield? A property that had never been disclosed in any divorce proceeding on the evening of May 18th. Questions, not accusations. Questions backed by 31 years of evidence that Ruth had assembled one careful page at a time. Clara was standing on the cabin porch with coffee in both hands when Lorraine called to confirm the letter had gone out. The mist was still sitting in the tree line at the clearing's edge. The creek ran steadily behind the building. The mountain did what mountains do in the early morning, which is hold its position without comment. "It is sent," Lorraine said. "Now we observe which direction they choose to move. How much time do we have before they respond?" "Men who are confident in their position take their time," Lorraine said. "Men who have found a crack in their foundation move quickly. We will know a great deal about the state of their foundation by how fast Marcus Elroy picks up the phone." Marcus Elroy called Lorraine's office that same afternoon. He opened by characterizing the documents Clara had produced as emotionally motivated and legally insufficient. He used the word unprecedented in a register that suggested mild professional distaste rather than any genuine alarm. He referenced the finalized nature of the settlement decree with the particular emphasis of someone placing a card on the table that they fully expect to conclude the hand. Lorraine said she understood his characterization. Then she mentioned in sequence the notarized statement, the bank records, the dated receipts, and the voicemail. There was a pause on Marcus Elroy's end of that call that Lorraine described to Clara afterward as the specific pause of a man who is running new numbers rather than the pause of a man who has no numbers to run. His register changed after that, she said. Not considerably. But it changed in the way that matters. In the 2 weeks that followed, Clara worked through the remaining names on Ruth's list with the same methodical attention she had once brought to the renovation of a neglected house. Not hurrying, not skipping anything, moving through each contact in sequence and listening carefully for what each person could genuinely confirm. She was not building testimony. She was collecting corroboration for what was already documented. She was not asking people to say what she needed. She was asking them to say what they had actually seen, because what they had actually seen happened to be true, and true things, when properly documented, have a durability that even the most carefully constructed alternative narratives eventually cannot match. Frank Hadley found both versions of the invoice in the second cardboard box he checked in his basement storage. The original made out to Clara Bennett for the final phase of the porch reconstruction, and the revised version that Preston had requested, with his own name substituted where Clara's had been. Frank had kept them clipped together in the same folder, because his organizational philosophy had always been that keeping everything was simpler than deciding what to discard. He mailed photocopies to Lorraine's office within the week. In the brief cover note he included, written on the back of a hardware store receipt, in the direct handwriting of a man who has built things with his hands his entire life and has no patience for unnecessary words. He said only, "I should have said something at the time. I did not. Here it is now. Here." Helen Carver found the photographs from the 2003 block party in a shoebox in her hall closet. 11 photographs from that afternoon taken on a film camera that she had subsequently developed and printed and kept, because she had always printed everything on principle. In 4 of the photographs, Clara was visible in the Maple Ridge Road garden, not posing, Not performing, actually working a drill in one hand and garden edging material in the other, her complete attention on the task. In 3 of those 4 photographs, the timestamp was visible in the lower corner. The automatic date printing that film cameras of that era embedded directly into the image. Helen had them scanned at the pharmacy and emailed them to Lorraine with a message that said, "She was always the one doing the work." I should have said that to someone a long time ago. Thomas Reed, going back through his own records from the 1994 closing, found a handwritten annotation he had made at the time. On the file, a standard practice of his, a brief note describing anything unusual about a transaction. The note for Maple Ridge Road said, "Family gift contribution documented separately at donor's explicit request. Donor is former county court employee. Notably thorough preparation." He confirmed to Lorraine in writing that Ruth had insisted on the separate documentation, had arrived at the closing with her own notarized statement, and a witness already arranged, and had asked specifically that the filing be structured in a way that preserved the legal distinction between her gift and the marital asset pool. Ruth had known exactly what she needed and had asked for it precisely, and Thomas Reed had noted it at the time because in 30 years of handling real estate closings, he had not once encountered a family member who arrived with their own notarized statement already prepared and witnessed. The picture was no longer becoming clearer. It was clear. The remaining question was whether the documentation was sufficient to force a different conversation. And then Lorraine called on a Thursday afternoon with the piece that answered that question. "I have the request log from the Marion Notary Office," she said. The formal inquiry made in August 2014 regarding the asset structure of the original Maple Ridge Road purchase transaction. The requesting entity is identified in the log. It is Elroy and Associates. Clara set her pen down on the table. Marcus Elroy went looking for Ruth's documentation. In 2014, Lorraine continued with the careful deliberateness of someone building an argument piece by piece. He would have found exactly what Thomas Reed's notes described: a properly filed separate family contribution that represented a significant vulnerability in Preston's position in any future division of marital assets. From that point forward, every document Preston asked you to sign: the 2015 adjustment, the 2016 correction, the 2018 restructuring, was designed not to simplify the administration of your shared finances, but to systematically bury the very piece of the record that Marcus Elroy had identified 11 years before the divorce was filed. Clara did not speak for a moment. So this was not something that grew over time. It was planned from the beginning. It was planned from the moment Marcus Elroy made that call to Marion in August 2014. And it was executed with legal assistance across more than a decade. That is a fundamentally different matter from what we were able to present at the original hearing. It opens remedies we did not previously have access to. What remedies? It means Lorraine said that I am going to request a settlement conference, and I am going to enter that conference with a notarized statement from 1994 bank records, dated purchase receipts in your name, 2 versions of the same contractor invoice, time-stamped photographic evidence, witness statements, a voicemail and documentary proof that opposing counsel personally investigated the vulnerability he subsequently spent 11 years helping to obscure. She paused for one measured beat. It means that Preston Bennett and Marcus Elroy are going to be asked questions that they have not prepared answers for, not in a courtroom where procedures constrain what can be raised, in a conference room where they can choose how to respond, and where that choice itself becomes part of the record regardless of what they decide. The settlement conference took place in a building on Pack Square in Asheville that housed several law firms and a mediation service, and had the specific institutional quality of a place where difficult matters are resolved without ceremony or sentiment. The conference room had gray carpet and a glass wall that looked out onto a hallway and a long table that kept both parties at a distance that felt professional rather than personal. The table's surface was polished to the point where Clara could see the blurred shapes of her own hands reflected when she looked down. Preston arrived in a navy suit, the same one he had worn to the original hearing. She noticed immediately that he had the same controlled posture, the same economy of expression that he had spent 30 years refining across hundreds of negotiations. What was different? And it was different she could identify it within the first 60 seconds was the quality of his presence in the room. In every negotiation she had ever observed him conduct, Preston arrived ahead of himself. His confidence preceded him. Reorganized the space, gave him the room before he occupied it. That was not happening today. He walked in and the room remained what it had been before he entered. Marcus Elroy sat to his right, a man in his late 50s who had the groomed, slightly pressurized quality of someone who has spent his entire career in rooms like this one and has come to regard them as his natural environment. He was genuinely competent and experienced and knew the relevant law thoroughly, which made him more formidable than a lesser attorney, and also in the current situation more precisely aware of exactly where the ground had shifted under his client's position. He spoke first. He described the situation as regrettable. He used the word unexpected in relation to the documents that had come to light. He said that no reasonable person wanted to reopen painful history, that both parties had an obvious interest in reaching a resolution, and that his client remained committed to an outcome that was genuinely equitable. The language was crafted with considerable skill to sound entirely reasonable, while committing to nothing and conceding nothing. Lorraine let him complete his statement without interruption. Then she opened the blue folder and set it on the table between them. The room changed. Preston looked at the folder. He recognized it, not the specific object perhaps, but the kind of thing it represented in this kind of room at this stage of a proceeding. He had spent 30 years reading rooms and reading the weight that particular objects carry in particular contexts. He read this one accurately. Something shifted behind his eyes, not the overt expression of fear, but the controlled adjustment of a man who has just discovered that the map he has been using does not correspond to the actual terrain. The first offer came from Marcus Elroy, following a brief consultation with Preston, conducted in voices too low to hear. The figure was constructed with the assumption that Clara was negotiating from a position of isolation and emotional exhaustion, that the documents were real but incomplete, that the fatigue of the process could be converted into an agreement on unfavorable terms before the full implications of the evidence became clear to her. Lorraine declined it without extended negotiation. The second offer was meaningfully higher. Lorraine reviewed it, made 2 precise notes on her legal pad, and declined again. She then placed 3 documents on the table in sequence, the notarized statement. From November 1994. The 2 versions of Frank Hadley's invoice with the names compared side by side, and the request log from the Marion office documenting Elroy and Associates' inquiry in August 2014. She did not elaborate on them. She placed them in a row and allowed them to be what they were. Marcus Elroy looked at the third document. Clara watched him look at it carefully. She had spent some time wondering what it would look like to watch a very composed and experienced man encounter the specific thing he had spent 11 years working to prevent from becoming relevant. And the answer was that it was not dramatic in the way she had imagined. He did not change color. He did not lose his composure. He simply looked at the document with the focused attention of someone who is reassessing a situation from its structural foundations. And then he turned to Preston, and they held a conversation that Clara could not hear. The third offer was substantially different from either of the first two. Lorraine reviewed it without expression. She made several notes. Then she looked at Clara and gave the small level nod that Clara had come to recognize over the preceding weeks, as meaning this is within the range of what we came here to establish. Clara looked across the table at Preston. He was looking at the document spread on the table's surface, not at her. The suit was precisely right. The posture was exactly as it always was. Everything about his exterior presentation was maintained with the discipline of a man who has built his professional self into an instrument and knows how to play it under pressure. And yet something had been removed from the room that used to arrive with him as a matter of course, and its absence was more communicative than anything she might have said. She spoke then quietly and without preparation, without the performance of emotions she did not feel. I am not here to get the house back. Preston looked up. She held his gaze and kept her voice level and clear. I love that house. I built most of what made it worth what it is, and you know that as well as I do. And now the record is going to reflect it. He did not answer. You spent years allowing me to disappear from my own work. I'm not asking you to become honest because it would be a noble thing to do. I am asking because the documentation no longer supports a version of events that excludes my contribution. The paper you spent 11 years arranging is no longer telling the story you arranged it to tell. Across the table, Marcus Elroy's expression held. Preston's jaw tightened by a degree that most people in the room would not have noticed. Clara noticed because she had spent 31 years learning to read the movements that happened just beneath the surface of that face. He did not speak. Outside the glass wall, the hallway carried its ordinary mid-morning traffic people, moving between offices with coffee cups and folders, conducting their own ordinary business. Inside the conference room, 31 years of a particular silence had finally arrived at the record it deserved. Marcus Elroy requested a recess. It lasted 19 minutes. When they returned, the fourth offer was on the table. The final settlement agreement arrived 8 days later, drafted by Lorraine's office and reviewed and revised twice before both parties signed. Clara sat with it at Ruth's kitchen table in the cabin on a quiet afternoon, the same table, the same light from the south window, the same creak audible behind the walls, and read every word of it before she touched the pen. It did not give her back the years. That was never something any document could accomplish. It did not restore the nights she had worked while Preston accumulated the credit, or the mornings she had spent acquiring skills that the official record of her marriage had chosen not to acknowledge. It did not return the younger woman who had stood in that kitchen in 1995 with paint on her left wrist and believed without any particular reason to doubt it that the honest and visible work of her hands would always speak clearly enough for itself. But it accomplished three things that were real, and that would remain in the record permanently beyond any future revision or reclassification. It provided financial compensation for Ruth Whitfield's separate family gift, formally recognized, specifically named, acknowledged as a contribution that had belonged to Clara alone and had never in any legal sense been marital property. It provided compensation for the documented restoration costs and the measurable value added to the Maple Ridge Road property, calculated from the records Ruth had preserved and the receipts that bore Clara's name. And it contained one sentence, a single sentence that had been negotiated word by word over the course of two separate review sessions that Lorraine had identified from very early in the process as the element worth fighting for, above any specific financial figure, because it was the element that could not be quietly adjusted or gradually reclassified or simply allowed to fade from significance over time. Clara Bennett made substantial documented contributions to the acquisition restoration and increased value of the property at Maple Ridge Road. Her name, her work, in the legal record, permanently and without qualification. Preston signed first. His hand moved across the page with the smooth efficiency of a man who signs documents as a professional matter and brings no emotion to the mechanics of it. Marcus Elroy initialed the designated lines. Then Lorraine slid the agreement across to Clara, and Clara picked up the pen, and her hand was completely steady. In the hallway outside the conference room, the building had gone quiet between appointments. Preston was standing near the elevator when Clara came out, and for a moment the layout of the corridor placed them in a proximity that neither of them had sought. He was looking at the elevator doors. He did not look at her. She walked past him. There was nothing she wanted to say that the document had not already expressed more permanently than words could manage. There was no version of a final exchange that would add anything to what had just been established on paper and in the record. Some things conclude without requiring a closing statement. The silence between them in that hallway was not the silence of something unresolved. It was the silence of something that had been finished completely, and without remainder, the way a well-built room is finished. Nothing left undone, nothing left to add. She drove back to the cabin. In the weeks that followed, people she cared about raised the question she had anticipated. Francis Mills raised it gently in a phone call. Lorraine raised it carefully during their final meeting. Helen Carver, who had become something genuinely close to a friend through the course of all of this, asked it directly. Did Clara want to push for the house? Did she want to go back and stand in those rooms with the full weight of what she now had? Did she want to reclaim the place itself? Clara considered it honestly. Then, one afternoon, she drove south on the highway and took the exit for Maple Ridge Road, and slowed as she came down the street. The dogwood was in bloom, the pale purple that she had waited for every spring for 31 years, never quite managing to take it for granted. The front porch had been freshly painted. The new brass lock caught the afternoon light in the particular way that new hardware does. The house looked maintained and entirely indifferent, the way houses look when they have been reduced from homes to assets. The pain came up in her chest, and she let it come. She did not try to redirect it or rationalize it or reframe it into something less uncomfortable. It was real pain, honestly earned, and it was allowed to exist. After a moment, it settled. Not gone, not resolved, but no longer in the position of authority it had occupied since the courthouse. Maple Ridge Road had been hers. Then it had become the place where she had learned the particular and corrosive discipline of disappearing from her own work. She had not spent the last several weeks fighting for the record so that she could return to a place that had taught her that particular skill. She had fought for it because her name deserved to exist in the story of her own life, and because Ruth had built the means for that to happen, and she was not willing to let it go unused. She drove past the house without stopping, north on the highway, up into the mountains, down the gravel track past the old white church. The cabin needed real work, and she began it in the order that made structural sense, because that was always how she had approached any building. The roof, first she hired 2 men from Spruce Pine who came recommended by people who had worked with them and knew what they were getting. They reset the flashing along the ridge, replaced 7 damaged sections of the tin roof, and sealed every seam before the next rain came. The porch followed the loose railing on the left side, rebuilt properly from the base. 3 deteriorated boards replaced the entire surface, treated against future weathering. The kitchen window that had been stuck halfway was a matter of the frame having swelled and settled unevenly over years of mountain moisture. She removed it entirely, planed the frame back to true, reinstalled the window, and it opened and closed without resistance. The old cook stove that had been in the cabin since before Clara could remember went out. She replaced it with a cast iron unit that was neither expensive nor new, but was solid and would function correctly for 40 years with proper care, which she intended to provide. She used the settlement carefully and deliberately, not to make the cabin into something other than what it had always been, but to make it fully and durably what it was. Ruth's kitchen table she sanded by hand with 4 progressively finer grits, and finished with a penetrating oil that fed the wood from within without filling the grain. And when the work was done, every scar and ring and crescent-shaped burn mark was still visible on the surface, still present, still part of what the table was. She had considered whether to try to remove them, and had decided against it, and not only because the work would have been technically demanding. They were the record of the table's history. A record was not a flaw. She had learned that lesson recently enough that it still felt new. She framed Ruth's letter, the 2 pages of careful handwriting slower at the bottom of the second page, but never losing its steadiness, and hung it beside the south-facing window where the morning light came through most cleanly. She transferred the tin box to a fireproof lockbox she purchased in Burnsville. She did not conceal it. She protected it. There was a difference between those 2 things that she had come to understand very precisely. By the first frost, the cabin had reliable heat and functioning light, and a kitchen that worked, and a porch that did not shift under her weight. She had established a long work table under the south window, found at an estate sale in Burnsville, solid oak, longer than she strictly needed. Exactly right. And organized along the adjacent wall, the shelves for her drafting tools and reference materials and the instruments she had carried in her car trunk through the whole preceding upheaval. Because some things you do not leave behind, even when you are permitted only 2 suitcases and a cedar chest. On the wall above the work table, she had mounted a county map and begun marking it. Structures she had driven past or been told about. Old buildings being misunderstood or neglected. Things with the specific appearance of places that had been abandoned rather than ruined locations where someone with the appropriate knowledge and the willingness to do the work correctly might accomplish something real and lasting. The calls started arriving before the first frost came. The first was from a neighbor 3 miles up the mountain road with a barn foundation that had been developing a problem for 2 years that he had been unable to identify. Clara went and looked at it and told him what it was and what it required, and he hired her to manage the repair. The second was a couple in Spruce Pine who had purchased an 1890s farmhouse they did not know how to begin addressing. They had been referred to her by Thomas Reed, who had apparently mentioned to someone that he had recently been in contact with a woman who knew how to read old buildings correctly. The third was a shop owner in Burnsville who wanted to convert the rear section of his commercial space into a small residence and needed someone to assess the existing structure and tell him honestly what was possible without dismantling what was working. They did not call Preston Bennett. They called her one morning in late November, almost 8 months after the night she had stood in the rain on Maple Ridge Road with 2 suitcases beside her feet. Clara was at the long work table under the south window with her coffee going cold and a set of hand-drawn plans spread in front of her for the Spruce Pine farmhouse project. The morning light came in at the angle she had not yet grown tired of moving across the floor from east to west, as the sun shifted and reaching the exact place where she had knelt to find the tin box, then continuing past it toward the far wall, changing color as it traveled from the cool, clear white of early morning into the warmer amber of mid-morning. And she had learned to follow it without consciously trying the way you follow the sound of the creek behind the building, absorbing it as a background condition of being in this specific place. The ashes in the grate were still faintly warm from the previous evening. The firewood stacked beside the door was down to the last third of the month's supply and would need to be replenished by the end of the week. Ruth's photograph rested on the shelf above the fireplace, the one Clara had found in the cedar chest, where Ruth was standing in the background of a Maple Ridge Road photograph. From the early years, not posing, not drawing attention to her presence, simply there, watching with the expression of someone who has already understood that what they are looking at is worth recording and has made the deliberate decision to witness it. Clara looked at the photograph for a long moment. She thought about what it had actually required. Not just the courage to fight once the documents were in hand, but the 30 years of quiet and unglamorous preparation that had made the fight possible at all. Ruth had not waited for the crisis before deciding what she believed. She had built the answer before the question fully existed. She had watched the legal system operate long enough to understand what it protected and what it did not. And then she had worked methodically within that understanding on behalf of someone she loved, one document at a time, one preserved receipt at a time, one quietly annotated photograph at a time. She had built the truth into a record because she had known from 30 years of courthouse experience that a record was what would last when nothing else did. That had been enough, more than enough. The phone rang an unfamiliar number, an area code she recognized as Mitchell County, the territory north of Yancey, the range of mountains beyond the mountains she could already see. Clara answered, a man's voice older, carrying the slight tentativeness of someone who is calling a person they know only by reputation and is not entirely certain their reason for calling will be considered sufficient. He had a farmhouse outside Bakersville. Perhaps 80 years old, he said, possibly more. Good bones, he had been told by someone, though he was honest enough to say he was not certain what that meant in practical terms. Someone had given him her name. Clara leaned back in her chair and looked out the south window at the clearing. The trees at the far edge were bare now, the rhododendron still holding its green underneath them. The sky above the ridgeline, the pale, clear, unapologetic blue of a mountain morning in late November. She knew what good bones meant. She had always known from the first afternoon she had stood in the kitchen on Maple Ridge Road and placed her hand flat on the old countertop and understood that the essential structure was still present, even when everything built around it had been neglected or ignored or allowed to deteriorate. Good bones meant that underneath the surface condition, underneath whatever damage, time, and inattention had accumulated, the thing was still holding. It meant that with the right knowledge in the right hands and the genuine willingness to do the work properly and completely, it could be brought back to what it had always been capable of being. "Yes," she said, "I can come and look at it." She wrote down the address, set the phone on the table beside the spruce pine plans, and went back to the morning's work. The creek ran steadily behind the cabin. The light continued its slow arc across the floor. The coffee went cold in the way that coffee goes cold when you are fully absorbed in something and have simply forgotten that it exists. Preston Bennett kept Maple Ridge Road. He kept the front porch she had rebuilt board by board, and the kitchen floor she had chosen tile by tile, and the dogwood tree she had saved on a cold November Saturday, with a treatment she had researched specifically for that purpose, and the amber porch light she had found at a salvage shop in Black Mountain and cleaned every spring because she liked what it did to the evening light. He kept the house that the legal record had always designated as his, and that 31 years of Clara's attention and labor and knowledge had made into something worth the keeping. But he did not keep the truth. He did not keep her name out of the document that mattered most. He did not get to compose the last sentence of her story, or determine the value of her work, or decide what the permanent record would say about who had actually built the thing he was living in. Ruth Whitfield had ensured that, not through sentiment and not through hope, but through 30 years of watching the legal system protect whatever the paperwork said, and then building the paperwork that said the right thing on the right date, in the right form, and keeping it safe in the one place that Preston Bennett had never thought to look. One receipt at a time, one carefully annotated photograph at a time, one notarized page at a time prepared 30 years before it would be needed, and waiting in the dark under a floorboard in a cabin in the mountains. Patient as the mountains themselves, ready for the morning when her granddaughter's hands found the right board and lifted it. Clara did not go back to the house that had taught her to disappear. She built her life in the place that had remembered her first, in a cabin with a scarred table and a south-facing window, and a floor with one board that lifted easily when you knew exactly where to find it, in the mountains of North Carolina, where the ridgelines held their shape through every season, and the creeks moved over stone without any interest in what the legal record said, and where the work that a person's hands could do remained when everything else had been contested and decided and signed and filed the most permanent thing there was.